This is Joshua Schmidt coming back to you with another episode of the Nerd Assassin podcast. On this Financial Friday series, we've been looking at some of the fundamentals of economics so I can form a better opinion on different economic policies. I feel like I've had a strong opinion but didn't really have those first principles. And we're doing this by looking at The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. This week we're looking at chapter 8 of The Wages of Labor. I think Adam Smith's biggest claim in this chapter is that the money price of labor is regulated by the demand for labor and the cost of necessities. So we'll go into how each of these different factors affect the money price of labor, how much you're paid for your wages. Originally, all of the produce went to pay for labor. So we're talking before land is privatized or before there's any employers. Every part of the produce belonged to me, the laborer. And in these conditions, in this state, the division of labor still would make everything cheaper. Everything would be produced by a smaller quantity of labor and purchased with a smaller quantity. So as division labor, I can get more done. Basically, this means I can create more stuff with less work. Therefore, things are cheaper. It doesn't take as much liberty from my life to create things. And then also everything that I purchase is going to have that same sort of effect on it. Because you were able to make 100 nails instead of 10 nails through the privatization before this division of labor, then if I need 10 nails, I'm now not purchasing a day of your time. I'm only purchasing 1/10 of a day. Although this might be the case, some things might seem more expensive because it didn't become as cheap in that amount of time. So let's say, for example, one labor, let's say the labor of brewing, you can produce 10 times as you were before through this division of labor. While another, baking, I can now produce twice as much in a day. So I've become really efficient at brewing beer, but this other person the bakers only became twice as efficient. It would feel like things are 5 times more expensive, but it actually requires half as much labor. So even though it seems more expensive, it's really not. It might take me 5 times as much beer as it used to purchase it, but in reality, that 5 times as much beer is only half of a day of labor. Instead of before, if 1 pint of beer was sold for 1 loaf of bread, that took a whole day of labor to get that 1 piece of bread instead of half a day. So actually, acquiring bread is now twice as easy as before, even as a brewer when I have to give 5 pints instead of 1. We're not really going to go any further into this state. We're not going to take this exercise of all of the price of goods going to labor, because very soon in today's day and age, pretty much every land is privatized and stocks accumulated. And as soon as private land exists, the landlord gets some of the produces of labor. And there's a second deduction of labor in the profit going to the person that's employing you. So we don't have to take that exercise any further. But most people need some money before the produce of their work actually exists. So they might need money for materials. They might not be able to pay for something out of pocket. So if I need to make nails, I might need somebody to buy the iron for me. And they might need subsistence until it's completed. So for example, somebody who's farming the land might need to pay to feed him, clothe himself while he's waiting for the crops to mature. So almost everybody needs some sort of money before what's actually produced, whether that's materials or subsistence. If there are some people that are independent workmen who can purchase the materials and maintain themselves before the actual goods are made. And in this case, they receive 2 distinct revenues, both wages and stock. But very few can pay for all the materials and maintain themselves until work is completed. Basically meaning most people work for somebody. And so there's a contract that needs to be made between the master, the employer, and the laborer, the servant. And this contract is at odds with each other. So a quote that I have here from the book: the workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. So basically, the employee wants to get paid as much as possible, and the master wants to pay him as little as he needs to. So we're going to dive into a little bit about how this negotiation ends up happening. What happens in like the real life with these two things at odds with each other. And really, the employer, the master, has many advantages to help them force compliance to get what they want. One thing that they have going for them is there's fewer employers than employees, so it's easy for them to collude. So if you only have in your county so many gas stations, it makes them easy to talk to each other and set the price. And during Adam Smith's time, it's actually interesting that there were laws that prohibited unions from forming, so it prevented the employees from working together to set a price. But there was no laws for collusion. So his point number 2 about the master having the advantage was that if you're the employees, you couldn't talk to each other to set a price, but if you were employer, you were allowed to, which is the opposite in today's day and age. Also, I think this is the biggest point, number 3, the master, the employer, has more money so they can hold out for longer. And you see this all the time in negotiations. Whoever can hold their breath the longest usually wins. He says that during his time, a master could last a year or 2 on their stock, a year or 2 just living off their money. Most workmen couldn't last a week. A very few could last a month, and almost none a complete year. Another quote that I have for you here. In the long run, the workman may be as necessary to his master as his master is to him, but the necessity is not so immediate. Basically what we were saying before, that the master might need the employee to work for him, but he can kind of sit back and wait while the employee needs a job now. Even though in Adam Smith's time you could collude as a master and you couldn't do it as a workman, you end up hearing about workmen collecting and negotiating as a team more than masters. So another quote here, this one is about how even though the workmen you hear about a lot and the masters you don't, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. He says, but whoever imagines that masters rarely combine is as ignorant of the world as of the subject. So if you think that employees aren't talking to each other about how to set prices for wages and labor, then basically you know nothing of the subject. You're completely ignorant of it. What really happens is the masters keep quiet about it. The employers have no reason to tell everybody that they're talking to each other. Also, it is unpopular for a master to raise wages. So they're going to be the other employees aren't going to be happy with that master who raises the wages. And we don't hear about them colluding just because it's so normal. So it's out of the ordinary for the employees to all band together and try to strike. But for the masters, it's so normal that people don't even talk about it, at least during Adam Smith's time. And in comparison, workers need to make a lot of noise to try and create enough outrage to make a speedy change. So they need to raise the wages quickly, and they need to get the master upset quickly. So they're making a lot of noise to try to get support on their side because they don't have enough of a runway, they don't have enough savings to last themselves very long. Another quote here, this is about the laborers. They are desperate and act with folly and extravagance of desperate men who must either starve or frighten their masters into an immediate compliance with their demands. So you have this uneven negotiating that's going on when they're at odds with each other. And another reason that workmen, you hear about them collecting more is the masters, the employees, end up calling up to the government to squash it quickly. So they end up calling for help right away. And what usually happens in the end when you see these strikes is the leaders, the ringleaders, end up being punished by getting jailed. So even though they're at odds and the masters have the advantage of trying to lower it as low as possible, Adam Smith has this claim that there is a floor to how low the masters can lower the wages. So even though they want to lower them all the way down to the basement, they're going to hit a floor where no one's going to work if you end up lowering it lower than this. He says, a man must always live by his work, and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. The wages, even for the lowest labor, the most common labor you could hire anybody to do, must be able to support a man and his family. What's interesting to me when I heard this was, I wonder what this means welfare does to this floor. I wonder if Adam Smith had a welfare in his day and time which said if you made less than X amount, we'll give you this much for food, would that make that floor lower? And then it just allows the master to lower the wages? I'm not sure, but it's just an idea that popped in my head. If you have any ideas on it or want to talk about it, feel free to reach out to me. There are some advantages to help a laborer raise his wages above this level of minimum amount to keep his family alive, basically. And I'm going to go over a bunch of them right now. So the first one is when a country is growing and increasing demand, masters have to bid on the work and wages end up going up. So if a country is growing and expanding quickly, someone has, if I'm a rich person in that society, I have more money than I need, so I end up hiring a servant. I end up hiring people to help me out around the house. Or if I'm an independent workman, let's say I make shoes, and I have more money than I need to rebuy materials to make more shoes, and there's more people asking me to make shoes than I can do it myself, I end up hiring a second set of hands. So there ends up being a lot of people trying to hire when the country's growing and expanding. And this demand increases the demand increases proportionally to the increase of revenue and stock in the country. So overall, an increase in revenue and stock that allows workmen and people to hire more increases the national wealth. So really what we're talking about, a country growing and expanding, is increasing national wealth, increasing GDP. The demand for more work that causes wages go up cannot possibly increase without the increase in national wealth. So as a nation grows wealthier, wages end up going up. And it's not about how wealthy a nation is, but how fast it's increasing, which causes this wage increase. So if you look during Adam Smith's time, if you compare England to North America, England is a much richer nation than North America, but North America, being a new nation, is growing really fast. So he compares the common laborer in New York. That person ends up making much more than in London, and also goods are cheaper in the US. So actually, he's making way more. And you also have North America's population growing much faster than England's as well, which is another sign of national wealth. Adam Smith says, the most decisive mark of prosperity of any country is the increase in the number of its inhabitants. So his claim is that a nation that's growing in population is showing that it has wealth. And he said the growth in North America is not just because of immigration, it's actually because people are having more children. So you have to remember, in the 1700s, children are working, whether it's out in the factory, out in ships, they're not just staying at home. And he said that in North America, children have become so much less of a burden that it actually leads to prosperity for a family with wages being so high. Children end up bringing a lot of money into the household. So in London, if you had a young widow that had a lot of children, it'd be pretty hard for her to get remarried because that would be such a burden on a family for a man to take on. But in North America, that young widow would end up getting married easily and quickly because children end up being a sign of prosperity and not a burden with a country that's growing that fast and children working. if a country's not growing, so if you have a country that's stable, their GDP is not growing every year, the wages end up becoming really low, which I thought was interesting. So it could be a wealthy nation where the GDP is just not growing and wages will start to plummet. Because what happens is each generation, there's more and more laborers, and the laborers end up bidding against one another, and the wages end up hitting that floor, which is just barely subsistence. So in his time, he gave China as an example. China was really rich, fertile, a really industrious country, but their wages are really low because they have been at this max rich industrious time for centuries. So you end up seeing, he quoted some books from his time of people that have gone and visited there, and he said you have tradespeople running around begging for labor, and you have many people who can't even afford a house that just live on their fishing boats, and they will eat the grossest river fish just because it's something to eat. And he's saying China was not a bad country. It was a rich, fertile country. It was just stagnant. And then if you compare that to a declining country, things become even worse than a stationary one. So stationary when things are bad, people are barely staying alive. But if you have a declining country, what happens is the skilled laborers can't find any work. So they're going to do the low-end jobs, the unskilled labor, and then people in the low-end class end up getting pushed out by the skilled laborers that rather get hired, and they end up just starving or begging. And the number of people end up declining through want, famine, and mortality until the country's back in balance. He thinks that some English settlements in his time of Bengal and the East Indies are actually in this scenario right now, where they're declining, right now being the 1700s. Another quote, "The liberal reward of labor, as it is the necessary effect, so it is the natural symptom of increasing national wealth." So basically, an increasing wages is equivalent to an increased national wealth. They go up and down at the same time. Whereas if a country's at a standstill, you end up with just scanty maintenance, just enough to feed my family. And if it's moving backwards, you're in starving conditions. It's hard to really to define what maintenance is, what subsistence is. When I say maintenance subsistence, I'm saying just enough to feed my family so they don't starve. But he gave some examples of ways that you can show that wages are higher than subsistence. In specific, he's talking about London in this case, where he's from. One is that you don't see wages fluctuate with the seasons in London, even though the cost for necessities of life change. So he said in London, wages are highest in the summer, but expenses are highest in the winter because you need to warm all your houses, which shows that wages are not regulated by the expense to raise a family, but rather the value of the work. I need more workers in summer, so I raise them higher, even though in winter they need more to survive. Also, you don't see wages fluctuate when the necessities of prices change. So in Great Britain, the wages have stayed the same for the last half a century, while the price of goods have fluctuated down and up during that time, which shows that you were still able to feed your family when it's down, so when it's up, you're actually making even more money. Also, another way that you can prove that wages are higher than subsistence is that wages don't vary from place to place in a country, even though the price of provisions will vary from place to place. So, for example, the price is the same both in and out of the city, but wages are higher in the city. So the necessities of life, like meat and bread, don't really cost that much different if you live in the country or the city, but wages are higher in the city. And actually, usually, the goods are even cheaper in the town. So in the town, essentially, if you're making bank, they must be okay outside of the city too. And another example he gives that in the past, the wages were lower while the goods were more expensive. It is not because one man keeps a coach while his neighbor walks afoot that one is rich and the other poor, but because the one is rich, he keeps a coach, and because the other is poor, he walks afoot. Basically saying, buying expensive things doesn't make you rich. Because you're rich, you're able to afford expensive things. he gives many examples in this category about how the grain and corn prices were higher in the last century while wages were lower, and the other necessaries and conveniences of life during the same century have increased even more in proportion to grain and corn. So basically, all of these prices of goods go opposite the way of wages. And we can see the same case in our last century. Even stuff that only the richest of rich could afford 100 years ago, anyone can afford now, whether that's phones, medicine, electricity, cars. They all become drastically available to even the poorest in the US. So backing up a little bit, now that we've looked at how wages become higher as a country is increasing, we want to look at what do high labor prices mean for a society? Is it good for a society or is it bad? And this may seem obvious that higher wages are better. One reason is more people are in the lower class than in the upper class. But he argues even the upper class is better served. Even the employers are better served with higher wages. Adam Smith says, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater of the members are poor and miserable." So you can't say my society is good and that it's flourishing and exciting if it's full of a bunch of poor people that can barely survive. You can only really say that your society is good if everyone's flourishing and happy, not just the employers. Also, poor people tend to have a lot more births, but children are more likely to die in poor conditions. So the poor people in the Highlands of Scotland, he said, could have 20 children and only have 2 survive. And that's obviously not good for society. So these higher labor prices make it so children don't starve. Like, that's obviously good for society. Other advantages do we have to high wages? So we're talking deeper into more people and more kids are born and raised. One quote that he gives here: "Every species of animals naturally multiplies in proportion to the means of subsistence, and no species can ever multiply beyond it." So if I can't feed all these people, even for humans, the number of people that will be living is going to start going down. It's regulated by how much we can feed them and help them to survive. So these higher wages allow us to have more. It's kind of a harsh way of looking at it, but Adam Smith talks about when wages are high, people can have more children and it becomes profitable. But when the demand for labor is shrinking, starvation ends up forcing us to have less children, ends up forcing populations to go down. He says, "It is in this manner that the demand for men, like that for any other commodity, necessarily regulates the production of men." So he's looking at it, like I said, pretty harshly. He's looking at it like any other commodity. The more we need men, the more that are born, the less we need them, it'll go down through starvation. So his claim is that increasing wealth leads to increasing population, and that's a necessary cause and effect. I actually think that this has been proven to be false in today's day and age, because I think we've seen first world countries end up having less kids than third world countries that are born and survive. So take this claim with a grain of salt. I have to do some research on it. Also, high wages are the happiest state for everyone in society. So another reason why it's good. Adam Smith says, "The progressive state is in reality the cheerful and the hearty state to all the different orders of society. The stationary country is dull, the declining melancholy." So everyone's happier when everyone's making more money. It doesn't matter if you're the high class or low class. It's the happiest state for everyone in society is when there's high wages. So we've looked at a lot about the lower class and how it helps them, but it even helps the upper class, because when people have high wages, they tend to work harder. Wages are your encouragement for your labor. Therefore, if I'm going to get more wages, I'm more encouraged to do more labor. For example, if I get paid by the piece, Adam Smith was saying there's a lot of people that got paid by the piece in London, and they'd actually overwork themselves because they were that encouraged to do labor. So raising, if we've all seen this, if you get paid almost nothing, if you're working at like a gas station making $7.50 an hour, you're not going to work as hard as if you work at a different gas station for $15 an hour. It's just natural. And he argued that when you're paying people by the piece, you're probably better off putting a cap on it so they can sustain themselves. Otherwise, they'll end up working themselves to the bone. And we actually see this in some companies today are forcing vacation. My company personally does it. You can't just have unlimited vacation days banked up. They're like, no, you have to take these. Adam Smith says, the man who works so moderately as to be able to work constantly not only preserves his health the longest, but in the course of the year executes the greatest quantity of work. So you're better off taking days off. You'll end up doing the most work in the year because you'll be able to recharge yourself. Some employers try to argue that a hungry worker works harder, and Adam Smith throws this out wrong, not good. It might have some people that are like, I'm worried about starving, I'm going to work hard, but it seems very improbable that somebody who's disheartened, ill-fed, and frequently sick would actually get more work done. You're going to get more work done if I feed you well, I take care of you, you love your job. So there's a lot of advantages to high wages, whether you're the low class or the high class. So let's look at some other cases that would push wages up or down. In years of plenty, where there's a lot of profits being made, a lot of capital going around, servants end up leaving their masters for their own industry. They end up wanting to work for themselves. But these cheaper goods that are around, when there's a lot, end up making profits higher. So the people that are employing want to hire more workers because there's just more profit to be had. The whole country's doing well. I want to expand my business, bring in more workers. There's more profit to be had. But there's less workers because people are wanting to go out and work on their own and more people wanting to hire. So this supply and demand ends up pushing wages higher. The employers end up bidding against each other to bid wages higher. Compare that to years of scarcity, years where there's not a lot of money being made. This uncertainty ends up causing people who were working for themselves to go back and want a stable job. They want an employer then. But these lower profits mean that I can hire less people. I kind of want to shrink my business. There's not a lot of money to be had out there. So there's more workers and less people able to hire them. So it ends up pushing wages down. So years of plenty push wages up. Years of scarcity push wages down. Employers are better off in these good years, in these years of plenty, than in struggling years. They get better deals on the wages, and rents and profits are higher. Some economists tried to show that more is produced in cheap years than dear years, but Adam Smith throws out this data in a few paragraphs of this book because he said that the people that are bringing about this data didn't really take into account all the circumstances of the country, whether there's peace or war, whether I want to be spending or saving. And also, in these years of plenty, not all the work will go into the public registrar. So when you have more independent workmen, they're doing side jobs, they're doing jobs under the table, and women end up working from the home. They can afford to stay home where they're going to sew clothes for their family, and that's not counted in this produce. So he throws out all this data. Although an increase in price doesn't increase the price of goods, increase in the price of labor doesn't increase the price of goods, there is some influence there. So there's a counterbalance which tends to go on that keeps the price of wages stable. So in scarcity, we talked about the demand for labor goes down, the price of labor goes down, but there's less goods available, so the price of goods go up, which makes, because goods cost more, the price of subsistence, which was the floor for wages, raises, and this puts pressure on the price of labor to go up. So labor wants to go down, the price of labor, how much I get paid, wants to go down because there's not many people hiring, but goods cost more, which tends to mean like for me to support my family, it's got to push it up a little higher. So there's this counterbalance that tends to keep wages more stable. Also, on the other end, in years of plenty, the increased wages would normally put pressure of a commodity up because it costs more to make it. So if I'm paying my employees more and I know I have to make this much profit, you'd think the price of goods would go up, but there's also a counterbalance here. So when I hire more people, I can use division of labor. I have more people, so people can become more specialized, so I end up producing more. And also, I want to buy more of the best machinery because I have the money to do it. And if I'm going to hire these people, I want them to be as efficient as possible. Therefore, that pushes the price of goods down. So people making more wants to push the price up, but the division of labor pushes it down, so it's a counterbalance. It ends up being more stable than if you looked at one factor. So scarcity, labor wants to go up and down, it comes counterbalanced. In plenty, the price of goods wants to go up and down, and ends up counterbalancing again. So that's why we don't see these like big fluctuations in years of plenty or scarcity. But the big thing to pull out of this chapter is how much you get paid depends on the demand for labor. How many people want to pay me? So that's the number one factor that does the price of wages. If there's a lot of employers and almost no unemployment, the price of wages are going to go up. If there's a lot of people that need to get hired and not a lot of people that have money to employ them, the price of wages will come down. And also the other pressure on the money price of labor is the cost of necessities. So how much food, clothing, shelter costs, that's going to change the price of labor too. So overall, big, long chapter. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Next week, we're going to look at stock, capital, investments. Me as an employer, what will cause my profits to go up or down. So if you have questions on this chapter, I know it was a big, meaty chapter, feel free to reach out to me. You can look me up at the Nerd Assassin on either Twitter or LinkedIn. Otherwise, subscribe to get an update when the next episode comes out. Thanks, guys. Have a nice day.